Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Hannah White, and I'm the CEO of the Institute. And it's great to welcome you all here to the IFG, and welcome to all of those of you joining us online. I am delighted to be joined today on stage by Admiral Sir Tony Radakin for his first speech since stepping down as Chief of the Defence Staff, a role he held from 2021 to 2025. During that time, he served as CDS to 4 Prime Ministers, and prior to that was First Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff from 2019 to 2021. So Sir Tony brings unrivaled experience of how key military decisions are taken, particularly given the period that his tenure spanned and what was going on in the world, and how the military interacts with government and advises politicians to shape defence policy. As I say, the world looks quite different now to how it did when you first became CDS. So I'm very interested to hear your reflections, Sir Tony, and hear about also your thoughts on the UK's priorities going forward. So the stage is yours.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be back at the Institute for Government for my first speech, as you said, in my new role as a former CDS. And if some of you are wondering how the transition is going, you'll be pleased to know my office have worked to manage the adjustment with all the sensitivity and respect that you might imagine. As a leaving gift, they presented me with a customised T-shirt. On the front, it says, "I'm still the CDS," followed by an asterisk. On the back, it says, "Chief Dishwasher Stacker." There is a fitting symmetry about being at the IFG at the end of my tenure. I spoke here in March 22, and that was near the start, alongside David Williams, the Permanent Secretary, to lay out some of our thinking on leadership and reform of defence. That was barely 6 weeks after President Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The siege of Mariupol was underway, and just a few days later, the first images emerged of the atrocities at Bucha. The events in the intervening time have been extraordinary. On the minus side, over 3 more years of grinding attrition in Ukraine, thousands of North Koreans fighting in Europe, Iran attacking Israel, Israel attacking Iran, Houthi attacks on international shipping, lapsing arms control treaties, and earlier this month, that extraordinary meeting of Putin, Xi, and Kim in Beijing. On the plus side, Ukraine is defiant. NATO is larger and stronger. Pax Americana is giving rise to a potential new Pax Europa through the coalition of the willing and through the NATO Hague Summit. Statecraft is returning. Atlantic-Pacific partnerships are flourishing. The democracies of Europe and Asia and the responsible monarchies of the Gulf are coming together to buttress and defend the global order. What we are seeing is an era shift from geoeconomics to geopolitics, from counterinsurgency back to state on state, from wars of choice to constant competition. The peace dividend is over, finito, ended. So taking stock against that backdrop seems appropriate. The risk is that we think that's it. It's not, and I have 4 prescriptions. The first is self-congratulatory. The military instrument is working. We have a plan. Our politicians take things seriously. We are safe for now. The second is more demanding. The need to deliver the plan, invest and follow through properly. The third is more sobering. Even if we have a plan and follow through, it may not be addressing some of our most serious risks. The nuclear international safety blankets are slipping away. What it reveals is very ugly and very dangerous. We need a call to new arms control. The final point is more profound and a familiar one for the IFG. The state is not working as it should. Fix it or everything fails. We must reform. Orthodoxy has it that departing chiefs are supposed to rail against their political masters, and that now is the time to tell it as it really is. So I'm going to disappoint this morning. I have served 4 prime ministers and 3 defence secretaries, and each has taken their defence responsibilities with the utmost seriousness. Perhaps more remarkable might be the revelation that prime ministers, chancellors, defence secretaries, and their service chiefs have frank and tough conversations. John Healey made a point that he felt challenge had been one of the hallmarks of our time together. Throughout my 4 years, my refrain was that Britain is safe because we are a nuclear power, a member of the world's largest and strongest defensive alliance, and because our closest ally is a superpower called America. That has held true for the last 75 years and needs to for the next 75 years. I briefed successive prime ministers to expect more of the military instrument than just keeping us safe. When we get it right, the military instrument enhances the authority and agency of the prime minister. This requires a maximalist approach to the military instrument. It is not the military as an insurance policy or break glass in an emergency. It's about maximising the benefit of £60 billion a year in the service of the nation, being the largest employer of apprentices, the largest provider of youth services, exports of between £10 and £15 billion a year, representing the nation for the Queen's funeral and the King's coronation, leading on Ukraine, leading the Joint Expeditionary Force, developing a 6th-generation fighter, collaborating on AUKUS, and being the reference armed forces for much of the world, as well as keeping us safe. This doesn't sound like the Department of Waste as we are sometimes characterised, and I'm pleased we may have reached a high point under this administration where the Prime Minister declares defence and security as a guiding principle for his government. And the Chancellor speaks of us becoming a defence industrial superpower. We contribute to society, the nation, trade, diplomacy. We are safe. And the good news is we have a plan for the next decade. It's called the Strategic Defence Review. It recognises that the world is getting more dangerous and our armed forces are not as strong as we would wish. It sets out how we will put that right. That leads me on to my second point, the need to follow through on that plan. This gets to a regular IFG theme, delivery. Whitehall agonises about whether it has taken the right decision. But the secret to effective decision-making is not whether you have made the perfect decision. It is about investing and following through on the decision you have taken. The Strategic Defence Review provides us with the plan, and the commitments made at the NATO Hague Summit provide the means. 5% of GDP on defence and security by 2035, with 3.5% on core military purposes. That is a momentous decision. The 2020s will continue to be tough. The SDR predominantly had up arrows and increased demands, and very little in the way of down arrows. That means difficult decisions, including potentially further cuts, are likely to be required in the short term. But over the next 10 years, defence spending in this country will grow by over 50%. Future chiefs will have the ability to invest in new capabilities, greater readiness, more resilience, better support, and increase mass in a way my immediate predecessors could only dream. That's quite the step change for the mindset of the Ministry of Defence. We're familiar with managed decline and steady retrenchment. We now need to develop the instincts for growth and acceleration despite the short-term difficulties. And we need to recognise and have confidence that this is an international commitment to more investment, and one that is at the heart of our security construct. It is a promise to the other 31 nations in NATO. It is a promise to our closest ally, America. It is a response to the security situation and the dangers we face. It is not a budget or treasury thing. It's a national security and first duty of government thing. And the Prime Minister is to be congratulated on taking such a profound decision. Following through also means having the courage to embrace technology and innovation and our industrial base in a much stronger way. It is often characterized as the willingness and ability to take more risk. It's the opposite. All the risk is vested in doing the same old thing and failing to adopt to the new technological opportunities. The chiefs have forged the ideas that came out of the SDR and are the strongest advocates in being able to put those ideas into practice. But it also means turning investment into production. That might mean looking at planning rules. Where and how quickly are the 6 ammunition factories going to be built? It also means incentivizing industry. Are government profit rates high enough above the cost of capital to attract investment? It might mean adjusting procurement and competition legislation where the rules are working against this outcome. Same with ESG rules. There has to be something profoundly wrong when UK pension funds struggle to invest in UK defence, but international funds do. And what is it that we are really trying to achieve? Is it about creating a new arsenal of democracy? If so, that requires the West to overcome national competitions and harness its collective might. Mario Draghi is right when he pillories Europe for having so many national variations of every piece of military kit. And I've spoken before about the race to artificial superintelligence. That might require another level of cooperation, pooling our most precious technological expertise with allies, and extending the shield of safety to others, just as we did through the nuclear umbrella. So we have the necessity, we have the plan, we know the means. Follow through, follow through, follow through. But that requires more than just money. It's domestic and international rules and planning and collaboration and risk-taking, and all laced with a stronger technological edge. That is really hard, but make it happen. And understand that security is the greatest public benefit of all. My third point is a sobering one and is too little spoken about. Most people my age grew up expecting nuclear proliferation. That never really happened. It has been managed for the large part very successfully. That now risks unraveling. It is one of the most dangerous aspects of our current global security architecture. We all know that technology is transforming the nature of both war and domestic security. In the 1950s and 60s, policymakers faced similarly uncertain terrain. Out of this period came the recognition that in an atmosphere of strategic competition and competitive armament, there was a need for continuous dialogue to manage potential escalation and miscalculation. And from that dialogue came an architecture of frameworks and agreements that helped keep the world safe and led to reduced nuclear arsenals, eliminated entire classes of weapons, and established clear protocols to aid de-escalation crises when they arose. We all recognize we are in a new era of increased risk of state-on-state competition and technological exuberance. This new era and third nuclear age includes the increasing prominence of nuclear weapons in the policies, doctrines, and approaches of our adversaries. And that also means the need for a continuous dialogue remains true today. But it is in short supply. Long-standing agreements such as the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, intermediate-range nuclear forces, and open skies have fallen apart because of Russian violations. This is despite their offering the conflict management, confidence building, and transparency that Moscow claims to seek. And in some regions of the world, such as the Indo-Pacific, such arrangements have never existed. The absence of formal arms control agreements between the United States and China is a glaring gap in the global nuclear regime. Given the complexity of modern nuclear dynamics, now is the time to be renewing those elements of the security architecture that still exist and remain vital. And now is the time to be investing in the people and relationships that will produce the new arrangements to help us manage the crises that could occur in the future. Taking this challenge is likely to be more complex than before. There are more states with more nuclear weapons. There is an increased risk of proliferation of nuclear and disruptive technology. And we have seen rhetoric and allegations weaponized as part of the new contested age. But it is something we must do. We need to step up our approach to arms control, and especially nuclear. It needs to rise up the international agenda. That remains the global danger to address. My final point is probably the most profound, and it speaks to a personal failure. Successive prime ministers rightly talk of the need for defence reform. It is probably true of the whole of government, but it's not happening as strongly and as quickly as it needs to. We need to understand why, and we need to put it right. Because if we don't, we will squander the additional investment, not look after our amazing people or unlock their potential. We will miss the technological opportunities and not keep the nation as safe as we could. There is something wrong. There's something wrong when the government spoke of the need for a national armaments director when in opposition in February 2024, and were unlikely to get one before February 2026. There is something wrong when successive governments profess the nuclear continuous at sea deterrent is our highest priority, but our sailors are having to put to sea for extraordinarily long patrols in some of the most complex machines on the planet that are beyond their original design life. There is something wrong when men and women in uniform make the extraordinary commitment to be willing to put their lives on the line, but we don't trust them to hire a car. Or even worse, when they're allowed to hire a van, we then insist on them taking an additional driving test. The reasons are various, but have common themes. There is a focus on process over outcome. We struggle to take long-term decisions. We lack real accountability. We fail to take risk. And we would rather waste money than risk money. We can overcome these weaknesses, but only with radical change. I have tried and failed, and this is my last throw of the dice. My concerns are not a reflection on the superb men and women whom we have serving in defence, both in and out of uniform. But it is a critique on the system and those that seek to protect the system at all costs. So a better way forward will involve adapting processes and procedures and protocols that are anathema to much of what the centre of Whitehall seeks to impose. Reduce the levels of control and risk public money so as to be more effective and go faster. Reduce the levels of hierarchy. We have increased senior civil service numbers in defence by about 85% since 2018, even as defence has got smaller and the military staff count has remained largely static. Reduce the power of anyone and everyone to say no, and impose the power of yes. If the person leading a project and one other are willing to say yes and are comfortable they can justify their decision to the Public Accounts Committee and the Secretary of State for Defence, then let the programme move forward. If you're not responsible for the outcome, especially individuals in other government departments, then you should not have authority in decision-making. By all means, allocate the budget and set the demand for the policy outcome, but then delegate and step back. Seek alignment through senior appointments and not balance. Balance sounds attractive. All sides will be taken into account, and so on. But it leads to everyone and anyone having a vote. Put one person really in charge. Create teams that are aligned and obsessed about the outcome. And you are much more innovative if you think you are about to be shot. Whitehall is too remote and lacks the incentive to do differently. Delegate, empower, mix tacticians with technicians, preference the front line, not the back room. Again, it's about outcomes and not coherence and tidiness and control. And finally, adopt the first principle of war, selection and maintenance of the aim. If the aim at a time of increased concern about our national security is to make our nation safer, then use all the levers of the state to bend to that purpose. Fortunately, we adopt much of what I say for Ukraine through our project Kindred. We spend billions at pace to equip Ukraine with drones and other technology and enable much more innovative approaches. We have even achieved that rarity in defence of a complementary NAO report and recognition that we are achieving increased value for money for the taxpayer. We do that by having fewer senior people in charge, a small team, less control, and the willingness to take both operational and financial risk. The bad news is that the same does not apply for our own armed forces. So what? Force the state to work to the government's outcomes, not the state working to and for the state. Accelerate change. Be less compromising. Delayer, restructure, do less. Reduce numbers overseeing. Empower, delegate. Scrape the barnacles from the hull to go faster. I will wind up there, both for now and for longer. A man I hold in great esteem, the late Admiral Mike Boyce, once said the role of a former CDS is to support the person on watch. So that is now what I intend to do, and is probably best done by being quiet and allowing the chiefs to speak for themselves. Thank you to the IFG and to everyone who has worked with me and supported me these past 4 years. It has been a remarkable privilege. And I have been fortunate throughout to stand on the shoulders of giants, our servicemen and women and all the civilians who support them. We are safe for now. Defence is not broken, but we can and need to be even better and even stronger. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So I've got some questions for Sir Tony, but I would also like to bring in questions from the floor here and online. I have an iPad, which, as long as I don't break it, which sometimes happens, will seamlessly feed questions from Slido to me. If you would like to tell us who you are and where you're from, that is always useful information when you're sending your questions via Slido. And also, if you like questions that are there, feel free to upvote them so I can see which ones are the most popular. But anyway, I'm going to start with some of my own. So you say, Sir Tony, successive prime ministers have been seized of the need to reform defence, but it hasn't happened as quickly or as strongly as it should have done. And you acknowledge, you say you tried and failed on some of that. Can you give us some examples of who or what stood in your way?
Yeah, so I think, so maybe if I give you an example where it felt much easier. So it was much easier being the head of the Navy. Now, some of that might be that it's a smaller structure, you're very definitely in charge, you're given a budget, you're given some direction by defence, you then have the obligation and you have the ability to get on with it. I think when you come up, and it's the same for, and I don't want to pretend that any of this is easy, but I think when you then come up to larger structures, this issue of who is actually in charge and where is the accountability and what authority has the person that we think is in charge actually got, I think becomes clouded. I think the current government, and John Healey especially, has recognised that. His policy exchange speech in February 24 spoke to that. I think we're making the adjustments so that Chief of Defence now has greater authority. We've got greater clarity about the Permanent Secretary. We're introducing a National Armaments Director. We've always had a Chief of Defence Nuclear. And those people have then got the individual responsibility and accountability to the Secretary of State. But that then links to the follow-through, and that actually have the people in charge got sufficient authority to achieve on the outcomes that you want them to achieve? And that, again, is where it gets clouded. And I come back to, you might have to take a tougher line, which is this what feels to me sometimes a consensual approach of people being able to say no, means that you've got these extraordinary Teams calls with 20 or 30 people who, and they're not in charge, they're not going to face the accountability if something goes wrong or it doesn't happen, but they have the ability to say no. And that exists within departments and it exists beyond departments. And that then slows it down. And my observation with Kindred is that the same people and the same departments, if you look at this through a Treasury, Cabinet Office and Ministry of Defence lens, except that because it's Ukraine and Ukraine is in a fight, then actually we're going to take more operational risks. We're not going to test everything to death before we pass it on into the hands of the warfighter. And we're going to take more financial risk. And what I think is frustrating is the outcome is so much better. So that to me is the sort of dichotomy. And I think my prescription is, right, we're just going to have to push into that space that we use when there's a crisis and bring it more into the mainstream. And by the way, it doesn't mean that everything is then going to become super risky and we're going to have lawsuits galore and so on. You can do it.
It feels very similar what you're describing to the clarity which COVID brought, I think, to Whitehall in terms of a really obvious objective everyone was pointing towards and an urgency. How do you think, though, that sense of clarity about strategic objectives can be done better. It's one of the things we talk about in terms of the centre of government not being able to be clear enough with the machine about what those strategic objectives are and sticking to them.
Yes.
But how do you think that could be done differently?
So I think it is a stronger discipline on that, particularly from a selection and maintenance of the aim. And you'll see, I think, you see it in other parts of government when, and it's, sometimes it is itinerary of targets and so on. I get that these things are difficult, but when you have real clarity of the outcome, then I think the machine works so much better. And this ability, this power of yes, it's a very respectful example, but it's a very simple one. When the late Queen died and we had her funeral 10 days later, I lived in a world where everybody said yes because everybody was so clear that what needed to happen was going to happen, and it was going to be a magnificent occasion. And if there was a problem with, right, we're going to do a rehearsal overnight, and that means you've suddenly got to provide 4,000 breakfasts in the middle of the night and so on, and it wasn't part of the contract. Well, actually, you've got a relationship with the contractor, and we're going to provide those breakfasts at 4 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't a let's establish a committee to work out how many breakfasts we're going to do, and it's that. And again, I'm at risk. I don't want to sound naive. I'm actually serious about the clarity of the outcome, and the amazing people that we have working in public service who want to do well for the nation, and trusting them and allowing them to get on with it. And I think we've got too many systems and processes that don't allow good people to get on with it.
So coming back to what you said about the linking what you're saying about the importance of accountability to what John Healey announced here actually in February about his attempt to create this quad at the top of the MOD and to have that clarity of accountability there. Just in terms of the turnover we're seeing in those roles, so you're departing, PUS David Williams is departing, Paul Lincoln, his deputy, has gone. Still no appointment, as you say, to the National Armaments Director role. I think it's only the Director of Defence Nuclear who's holding the continuity. How is that going to affect the MOD's ability to deliver defence reform?
And again, this may be uncomfortable. My prescription for those, when you're in big change, you get to that anxiety, you're moving people over, there's always the risk of continuity and so on. The answer is go faster and get through that and appoint the new people. I've got a successor, appoint David Williams successor. You've got an interim National Armaments Director anyway in Andy Starr. You've got some content. Don't fret about it. I had the same. We had the same in COVID, and anxieties when I was first Sea Lord. You're trying to do too much. You're trying to go too fast. I think for most of us in public service, you dream of going too fast, and if you're going too fast, guess what? You can slow the machine down, but try to go really fast and get through that discomfort, because the discomfort will always be there. And I worry that we then get into that slight agonizing mode of all those anxieties surfacing, which are normal with big change programs, and you have then got to push through. And so I recognize there's a risk of continuity, but the prescription is to get on with it and to appoint the new people and push the new protocols, the new procedures, the new ambition down through the system. And to be honest, I think that's what John Healey's trying to do. I think that's what the department's trying to do, and it's going to have to push really hard because it gets to that stage where it's difficult. Okay,
so why? By the way, why do we still not have a NAD?
So I think we got to a point that we thought that we had appointed an ad, and then there might be personal reasons why that appointment fell through. But if you look at the history beforehand, and again, I think this is a description, clarity by the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State then has to go through quite an elaborate procedure, particularly when it comes to paying a salary that is a very high salary for public service. That takes forever. You then, that then means that you have an elongated recruitment process and so on and so on. And that to me is another example of, well, this is what we want. Let's go with that. That's the decision. Now try to enable that decision to be effected as quickly as possible. And even though you're the Secretary of State for Defence, you then find that it's going to take you a long time, and you need an awful lot of people to at least sanction your decision. And that's why these things take long.
So one of the things about Westminster-style democracies is that ministers often lack expertise or experience in an area where they're being asked to lead. And that's where we would argue that the presence of a permanent impartial civil service is really important, public service. But in defence, you often do have ministers who have some kind of practical experience of the military. Recent examples including Ben Wallace, James Heapy, Alistair Cairns. How easy is it to maintain your respective roles in terms of policy, setting policy, and giving military advice?
I think it's been relatively easy. I think most of those people that make the transition from military into politics, they recognise that they've got that military understanding, and they might understand some of the ethos, the code and so on, but quite often it's been at a more junior level. They've then made a transition into politics. With Al Khan's, it was super quick, and suddenly he's a minister.
Overnight.
I think Ben Wallace would talk about his journey through being a Scottish Member of Parliament and so on. And therefore, by the time, for most, I think, ex-military politicians, by the time you're coming to these senior posts, you've made that transition. You're in your political mode, and you just, you're both in two different roles. And that what actually happens, and I think it happens regardless of your military background, is you then have sensible conversations. And so that's one of my other reflections. I think it's a real privilege as the Chief of Defence or as the Permanent Secretary to be able to have difficult conversations with the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Defence Secretary about some of the difficult issues, particularly around money. But you then have to respect that privilege, and that allows you to walk around the corridors of power, and that is something that you then don't search for column inches in the media. I think so. The crucial bit for the relationship, I think, is the ability to have sensible and frank conversations and the respectfulness of that privilege. And that, on the whole, has been my experience. And I'm really grateful for that. And I commend various prime ministers and various defence secretaries for allowing that to happen.
So we are speaking just a few days ahead of President Trump's state visit to the UK. You talked about the importance of the UK's relationship with America and historic importance. What's your assessment of how reliable a defence partner the US is now to the UK and President Trump's approach to diplomacy?
So I can only go from my own experience, and I sort of described this previously. That there's an awful lot of commentary, and I can understand why it generates such commentary, but I think you've seen, and I think it's been a whole of Whitehall approach, which has been a very steady and focus on actual meetings and actualities. And if I take my experience, I accompanied John Healey to see US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth relatively early on in Brussels, and we had incredible clarity from Pete Hegseth to say that the relationship would continue, but there would be adjustments because America is focusing more on the Indo-Pacific and its homeland security, and that would mean that Europe would have to do more and take more responsibility. But that was something that, again, was caveated with the nuclear guarantee and umbrella continued, but the conventional defense relationship would change. And then I think you've seen that's what's happened. And you've seen a Europe respond. You've seen an amazing NATO Hague summit. You're seeing, over 20 nations come together as part of the coalition of the willing. That is matching the ambition of America for Europe to take more responsibility. It's matching Europe's recognition that it also has to do more. And then the backdrop to that, for most of us in uniform, is decades of being really close to our American counterparts. And I think that's the same in the intelligence space. It's definitely true in nuclear, and it's obviously true in terms of defense. So it's not, when I talk, the froth of commentary is slightly different to what I think has been our experience. And all of that bears out of America is this phenomenal ally for the UK.
Okay, one final question for me, and then I'm going to come to the audience. So audience, be ready with your questions. You ended your remarks saying you intend to be quiet from here on. Even though, having left office, you are now free to say what you think. This government has a policy of not allowing officials to speak in public where there's going to be Q&A and potential media present. What is your assessment of the implications of that ban?
So I think it's the prerogative of government to make those decisions, and that's the position of the current number 10. It's similar to when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, and I think the role of officials and military is to follow the government line. I think there's a debate about whether or not that line is too stringent. So are you missing an opportunity? I'd like to think that my speech is not some tilt at government. I'd like to think it's trying to reassure people about the defence and security situation, trying to reflect on what are some of the big issues. I think that that relationship, therefore, might allow the opportunity for officials to sometimes be helpful for the government in explaining public policy, and that you use officials, and especially military, who in all the surveys of public trust tend to have quite high levels of confidence that the public have in us, and therefore that debate as to is it too angular, and is government missing an opportunity? Is there a responsibility on senior officials to explain public policy? I think that is a debate that we need to have, and I've seen the IFG commentary on it in the past.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to some questions from the audience. My colleague Lauren has the magic mic. Do you want to come down here to the front? You okay?
Hi, Dan Saber from The Guardian. A couple of questions on nuclear. When you say our sailors having, when you say there's something wrong related to Trident, our sailors having to go out to sea for extraordinarily long patrols, some of the most complex machines on the planet. Why is that happen? What's gone wrong? And what's at risk? And what's at risk here? Are you talking really about trying the patience of the sailors, or are you saying there's some technical risk? I doubt that you are, but nevertheless, I want to just unpack that. You know, what's gone wrong and what's the risks here?
So on the risk side, we're managing through phenomenal people that make that commitment, through our engineers, through our relationship with industry. We're managing the fact that we're running on those nuclear submarines longer than we first anticipated. So it doesn't mean, right, we shouldn't be saying, oh gosh, there's an enormous risk there. But it's just more difficult in delivering it. And the reason why it's more difficult, it goes back to the need to understand long-term decision making. So if you look, it's been successive governments, as way back as 2010, 2016, 2018. So Labour, Coalition and Conservative governments that I think look at nuclear, these enormous sums of money, these decisions that you're taking quite often for a decade or 2 decades ahead, and therefore it feels very comfortable. We can just move it on a few more years. But then when that then catches up with you, and that's why it's so hard. And if you're on Watch Now as a British Prime Minister, or each of the Prime Ministers that I served, they all recognise that. And so if I take my journey through Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, all of them are investing huge amounts of money and investing even more in nuclear. And some of that will correct some of the issues that we've currently got. But the real impact will be in a decade or 2 decades' time, because nuclear is slightly different. It's got this longevity to it. And that's all I'm saying, is that the ease of which, oh, that's a long way away, therefore I can push the money right, or I can slow the money down, or I don't really need to invest in the infrastructure, at some point it catches up with you. And it shouldn't be catching up with something that you declare is your highest priority. And I think we've got that pressure at the moment. We're dealing with it. We're investing for the future. We need to recognise that we need to continue to maintain that investment for the future, so that subsequent governments are not under so much pressure.
Okay, next question.
Sorry, can I just follow up CDS on that? I mean, why didn't
Could you tell us who you are?
Sorry, I'm Jonathan Beale, BBC. Why didn't you say something when you were CDS about this? You're sending out men and women on patrols that last 6 months on machines, and a limited number of machines. You are the head of the armed forces. I mean, you're saying it now when you've left office. I just can't understand why you didn't say something when you were in office. Thanks.
To reassure you, Jonathan, I think I've said something about this when I was First Sea Lord, when I was Chief of Defence, Ben Key when he was First Sea Lord. I think there's a long line of First Sea Lords who have recognised that the transition that we're making from our current Vanguard class of nuclear submarines to the future Dreadnought is one that is going to be tough, because it's a bit later than first anticipated. And I think we've been really clear on that, and that's why you're seeing the additional investment. And the additional investment is enormous, and it has been sustained through at least the last 4 Prime Ministers, and it strengthens even more so in the future. So that, and I think for anybody that is in the submarine service, they know that has been a feature of not only First Sea Lords, it's also being reflected by Chiefs of Defence, and it's being reflected by Defence Secretaries, and it's being reflected at the Prime Ministerial level. Keir Starmer and John Healey, when they were in opposition, spent a lot of time looking at the nuclear agenda. And you've seen in the first year of this government, again, Keir Starmer has invested further in nuclear. There's the triple lock, there's the having gone to a day zero, there's having gone to the cutting steel for HMS Dreadnought and so on. All of that is a reflection of the prominence of nuclear and the seriousness with which it's taken. So I reject that this is something that's been hidden. It may not have been big in terms of a public piece and so on, but definitely in terms of inside the system and the clarity that exists in the system, I think this has been an enduring theme all the way through.
Okay, I'm going to take our most popular question online from an anonymous questioner. You repeatedly reference the importance of technology. What can UK government do to improve the UK's ability to purchase, develop, manufacture, implement and maintain advances in technology that underpin effective defence?
So I think that is the way I describe it, and I think this is similar for all the chiefs. If we were having these debates about technology 5 years ago, it felt to me that you were having to argue that there was a really sharp edge there, and that you wanted to bring it in, and it was an argument as to whether or not it would have much of an impact, and is this snake oil, and actually do you need to stick with your traditional platforms? I think what's happened now is there's nobody arguing about the importance of the technological edge. The issue now is about how do you mainstream it. That then gets to the much more difficult issues. So have you got space in your budget to be able to embrace that technological edge? Well, you might have to argue for more money, or you might have to suppress some of your current spend in order to create the headroom. You also might need to take more risk, and you might have to adjust some of the programs that you've got. And I think you're seeing that. So if you take the head of the army and his ambition to double lethality by 2027, triple it by 2030, he's saying that's doable by embracing technology, by linking it up, and that he might slow down some of his traditional expenses in order to enable that to happen. The same came out of the Strategic Defence Review. At the moment, you've got 2 aircraft carriers. You've effectively got 1 carrier air wing. The ambition in the future is to have 2 carrier air wings. How do you do that? Well, you can't afford to just buy more jets, but you can get there if you mix jets with drones. And you're seeing the current First Sea Lord demanding that those drone programs for aircraft carriers happen in the next couple of years. And he's already said that the next time it's going to the Indo-Pacific, he expects to see that sort of hybrid fleet. So that is a mixture of money, a change in mindset, then setting the ambition, then driving to that ambition, and acknowledging that you might have to take risk in your existing program or adjust your existing program in order to get there. But it's very, very different to a few years ago.
Okay, I think because there's a lot of questions, we better take them in groups.
Yes,
so can we come down the front here?
I'll give shorter answers.
There's 2 here.
Yeah, Robert Fox, quickly, retention. We've heard about recruiting. Retention does seem to be on the point of crisis in some aspects of the armed services. What can we do about it? Do we need to do something about it immediately?
Starkey from The Sun. Admiral Radakin, you've always been seen as an optimist and painted a sort of encouraging picture about Britain's role and NATO's role, particularly in the wake of the war in Ukraine, and that Russia's suffered these great losses. But we've just seen them launch what appears to be a deliberate drone strike on NATO territory. Very hard to sort of see that not as an armed attack on a member, on one. And there's been no tangible, visible military response from NATO. So 2 questions. Should NATO respond more firmly? And also, like, what is it going to take to stop Vladimir Putin to win the war with Ukraine?
Yes.
Thanks, and we'll just take this one here.
Hello, my name's Matthew Trimming. I've got a private equity background and senior advisor at Public, which Sir Tony has inspired us to do work in defence through the Percy Hobart Fellowship. So that's my thank you. A quick reflection on private equity.
Can we have a question rather
Yes,
than reflection?
no, of course, it's just coming. We need a stronger demand signal for insurers, for pension funds, and for private equity to move beyond the ESG piece. And the question is that frozen middle that you alluded to in all organisations, not just public sector, if you had a sort of magic wand and you could do one thing to unfreeze that, to focus on the innovation that you've always promoted, what would you do?
Thank you. So if I quickly, Robert, on the retention recruiting, so the good news on the recruiting piece is that we have 10 to 15 people applying for every place. The less good news is that we have got to get better at bringing those people in. And, but strategically, it's healthy, and you've seen each of the services, so the Air Force and the Navy are now net positive, Army is getting there, and that's something forecast towards the end of this year is stepping into next year. And you're right to reflect on retention, though, because that's a big loss when you've spent all this money and you're losing the expertise and the capabilities people have got. That is improving as well. And it's a really boring answer, but the reflection is that we think that people stuck with defence during COVID because I think that was the sensible thing to do, and we were seen as being a very safe employer during a difficult time. And then post-COVID, you've seen the retention figures worsen, and now you're seeing them steady to get back to what is always about a norm of about 5 to 6%. And then the things that we're doing, which I think are important, are two of the largest pay awards for decades were earlier this year and last year. And then the other piece is buying back our housing supply from Annington Homes that then allows, instead of paying the money to the landlord, allows us to use that money to invest in those properties and to look up. So that's what, and then I also think the other element is can we be a better and more flexible employer? Because we've got young people who I think demand a slightly more tailored approach, and can we respond to that? So it's getting better both in terms of recruiting and retention, and that's the journey that we're on. In terms of Jerome, in terms of NATO, so on the you've already had a NATO response. So Sakior has declared that he's going to strengthen the eastern flank. That means particular help to Poland and Romania. The bit that I think is significant, and is why it's another mistake by Russia, is you've also seen that NATO is involving its transformation command. So Admiral Pierre Vondier has been given the responsibility to not just strengthen immediately in Poland and Romania, but to strengthen the whole of the eastern flank. And we're doing it in a traditional way in terms of increased surveillance, additional jets. But the really significant piece is the recognition to speed up the plans that exist to have a much more modern eastern flank in terms of how you defend it. And to take some of the ways that Ukraine uses and to put that for NATO. So that could be some of the acoustic systems, it's some of the warning systems, it's the use of drones, it's being much more adept. And that makes it much harder for Russia in the future, and it's Russia that's triggered that. In the same way that Russia has triggered NATO getting stronger from 30 nations to 32 nations, NATO spending more than 50% over the next 10 years than it's done in the past. So there's a hell of a response by NATO. And then the things that also exist is a whole range of options as to how NATO might respond. And then there are economic responses. So is that the EU again in terms of sanctions? Is it that Russia puts at risk, further at risk, its reserves that it's got in European banks? And so there's a whole range of responses that NATO and Europe and the West have got. And that's why I constantly say we shouldn't be cowed by 19 drones that end up in Poland. That's significant for Poland, but that is not an attack by Russia on NATO. And you saw that the response by NATO was in Article 4 language rather than Article 5. And then in terms of how do we continue to help Ukraine to defeat Russia? Well, I think what you're seeing is the strength of Ukraine and the cost that it's imposing on Russia. And you're seeing a continued support by the West. And what is happening is increased economic support, increased military support. And then do you see the synchronizing of that? And then does that create even greater problems for Russia? And that's the debate that's going on with President Trump, that's going on amongst allies. And that is the way to apply even more pressure on Russia and even more support to Ukraine. And then on the private equity, so some of this I think is kind of 2 or 3 things. One is just having the conversation, and and I'm grateful, Matthew, for because these have been separate worlds, and they would never meet, and so I think there's much more meeting there. There's much more of what I would call a normal conversation, whether it's with the big banks or whether it's venture capitalists and so on. So it's just, can we enable that? And then the bit that I think is exciting is then, do you create NATO banks? Do you have to create these residues of funds that are much easier for private capital to invest and give us access to some of the venture capital that's out there? And is that a mechanism that then means that you don't have the full weight of public accounting and expenditure rules? And is that the way to then go fast? And does that, if that's successful, does that attract more investment and so on? I think that's happening in America. I think it's still quite sort of early days here. But what you're seeing is at least you're seeing people that can talk to it and those conversations going on. It's another one where we need to push on. But it's very, very different to a few years ago.
Just because I'm conscious this may be the last time we hear from you, at least soon in public, I'm going to take one last round of questions. So there's one here.
Hi, I'm Pete Apps from Reuters. I'm interested in your characterisation of those conversations with Pete Hegseth, and it sounds like they've been clearer in private than they have been in public, that the conventional level of support to allies will be lower in Europe, but that nuclear support remains as strong as ever. That obviously will have to be renewed with each new US president. The president sits behind all those 3 rungs of safety you talk about. What does that mean about the messaging we give to allies, Poland, South Korea, Japan, maybe even Australia, that are beginning to have these conversations behind closed doors about whether they need their own nuclear deterrent? And also, what does it mean for us? Currently, both our nuclear weapon systems, Trident and the new free-fall nuclear bomb, are dependent on the Americans in various shape or form, as to whether we should have a free-fall nuclear bomb or a nuclear missile that we can drop for our own planes that is solely sovereign as a requirement, maybe not in the next 3 years under this president, but certainly under the next 10, 15, 25.
Thanks. Can we go back in the corner there?
Thanks. Esther Weber from Politico. So following on from that President Trump and Pete Hegseth sent quite a signal when they entered office that Europe, the entirety of Europe, but also Ukraine, would be something that Europe would have to take more responsibility for, that they were sort of pivoting away from. Do you think the UK has been instrumental in sort of keeping the US in those conversations? And how optimistic do you feel about America remaining an ally, a strong ally of Ukraine?
Thank you.
Thank you. And you can just go to the back row there.
Phoebe Chubb from CMS Strategic. Do you think that we're moving fast enough with the investment in integrated air missile defence, pledge of $1 billion in the SDR? And do you think that more can be done to raise the awareness of our capability in this area with the wider public?
Thank you. So if I take almost the first 2 questions together. So actually, SecDev Pete Hegseth was equally as clear in public. So that the conversation that I mentioned was a Ukraine. It was a precursor to the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, and then Secretary Hegseth made a point of saying that he was going to say this in front of the cameras, which is always the opening piece at a UDCG. And that candor, I would say we should take some reassurance from. This is it's the clarity of saying America may be stepping back a little, but it's not stepping away. And the other piece, to Esther's point, is that there is a mutuality of interests that still exists with America and with its European allies. And so that doesn't evaporate. And I think America's been incredibly clear. And I also think it's been quite a comfortable conversation, even though it's been an extraordinary one. And it was crystallized at the NATO Hague summit. And in terms of what Sec-Gen Mark Rutte was able to pull together. A year ago, if we'd been saying that NATO was going to increase its defense and security spending to 5% and its core military was going to be 3.5 by 2035, that just wasn't on the table. That's why I say it is such a profound and momentous decision. And we need to acknowledge that. And then the other bit that goes with it is to the Ukraine point. Under President Biden, I think it was really clear: support Ukraine, impose a cost on Russia, maintain international unity, avoid escalation. I think those aspects still exist now. But what President Trump has brought in is a much stronger piece about how does this end, how do we achieve peace? And part of that is the willingness for even greater American support into the longer term with the language of security guarantees, but again, with the honesty and the caveat of saying, but Europe, you are still going to have to be the principal actor here. If President Trump can broker a ceasefire or peace agreement, Europe, you're going to have to back it in order to cement that, and it will be supported by America, and then we work out the individual parameters and so on, and that needs to stay private, particularly whilst we're in the negotiation phase. So I can, from my perspective, that's been quite a positive conversation all the way through, and you've seen the crucial bit that America provides, which is intelligence, be maintained. And then the other piece that's overlooked is Ukraine has strengthened through this period. So about 55% of all weapon and ammunition is now made, sourced, funded from Ukraine. About 25% is from Europe and about 20% from America. And so that's an extraordinary change over the course of the war. And we need to be careful that we acknowledge that it's a different lens now. And then on the integrated air missile defense, you're right to point out that this is, the £1 billion clearly it's welcome, clearly it's significant, but it's the start of an integrated air missile defence rather than this is now, the UK will have a fully operable integrated air missile defence. The bit that I think we need to then take into account, and it's partly our geography, is just recognising that it's the whole of NATO that is increasing its integrated air missile defence, and we benefit from that. And that's what we're actually trying to do is to merge that investment across 32 nations back to the strengthening on the eastern flank, so that there's a collective position, because that's far more effective than having 32 separate systems. And that's to our advantage and to everybody's advantage. So it's £1 billion, that's significant. It's the start of a journey. And that's where that progress to 3.5% and the significance of that then is, right, how do you create a fully capable system, and when is that going to be in place? Is that at the back end of this decade? Is it as you step into the 2030s? But what's significant is that's now in the vernacular, and it's part of UK defence, and it's also part of a big NATO conversation.
Brilliant. Well, I'm afraid we will have to draw it to a close there. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us here at the Institute for Government. And can I ask you to join me in thanking Admiral Sir Tony Radakin?
Thank you.